1 billion years ago represents the cosmetic difference between a Jigglypuff of today and a Screamtail of yesteryear. A billion years? Is that really true, or is that Pokédex entry just made up information, or perhaps paranormal propaganda? If that's really true, the oldest Pokemon that we knew about before this were 300 million years old, which is like Kabutops and Genesec's ancestors, which might also be Kabutops. But 300 million years? That's a 700 million year difference between the existence of Kabutops and Screamtail. Here in the real world, we didn't even have animals back then. People didn't exist, most plants didn't exist. In fact, it was mostly just single-celled organisms floating around this rock. So can Screamtail, Jigglypuff's ancestry, really date back that far? To a billion years?
Well, maybe not. It seems the Dex entries for the Paradox Pokemon like Screamtail are somewhat fanciful in nature. So perhaps they shouldn't be taken literally. But all the same, the timeline of Paldea and how it is connected to the larger Pokemon world is fascinating. So shall we journey together through time itself to cover the entire timeline of the Paldea region and how it connects to the other events of Pokemon history.
Sounds good, but we are going to have to ignore some of the inconsistencies in Scarlet and Violet, like the Pokemon Brute Bonnet, which has a pattern on it that looks like a modern-day Pokeball. This is a Pokemon from the ancient past, but Fungus has a Pokédex entry talking about how it inspired the look of the modern Pokeball, so they can't both possibly be true, can they? Yeah, good, an explainer video for that. I'm going to guess Wibbly Wobbly...
Wibbly Wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, yes.
Ah, yes, okay. Well, I'll leave that link at the top of the description. But for now, let's start with the first factual event stated in the games. Just a wee little bit on from a billion years ago with Screamtail, Mrs. Rifle, my favorite history teacher, gives us our first date on the timeline. 1 million years ago.
1 million years prior to the events of Scarlet and Violet was, according to Mrs. Rifle, the formation of the Great Crater of Paldea. History at this time is effectively unknown, and there is a lot of that aforementioned wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey stuff going on within the Great Crater, so we're taking this one with a pinch of knackly. Get it? But if that is true, then it was likely created by some kind of meteorite, or perhaps the as yet unseen third legendary Pokemon. As you know, people weren't exactly going around causing large explosions that create craters a million years ago. It just wasn't happening. In the rest of the Pokemon world at that time, not much happened in recorded history, though that's to be expected with such a distant past. It's around 20,000 years ago that we finally start seeing things pop up in recorded history. Things like Claydol being created by humans and Eternatus first falling from the sky. Of course, many Pokemon did roam the world at the time, like Relicanth and the various fossils, but much of their DNA dates back hundreds of millions of years, so relatively speaking, the crater's formation happened basically last week in comparison to that.
Now, the next oldest date is quite a skip along the timeline, being 2,000 years ago, and this is the time that the Paldean Empire came into being. And yes, you heard me right, I said 2,000 years ago, not the common data of the Pokemon world over the last several generations of 3,000 years ago. We know that AZ's war happened 3,000 years ago, and so too did a number of other events, but the Paldean Empire specifically didn't exist then. We actually don't know much about the region's history before this point, but 2,000 years ago, the Paldean Empire and the Great Exploration began, and it lasted for a millennia, 1,000 years. So at this point in time, the Galarian, Unnovan, and Kalosian empires are all up and running and warring and have started. But it's interesting to note that the Paldea region specifically is described to always be at war at this time. With old abandoned watchtowers and castles, ruins all over the region, it seems like this was a world at war with itself. Elsewhere in the Pokemon world 2,000 years ago was also the destruction of the home of the Draconids and the creation of Meteor Falls. The Draconids seem genuinely very absent from this game, which as modern Pokemon games go, is quite odd. The Draconids tend to pop up absolutely everywhere, but they seem to have no connection to Paldea at all. It's believed that the Draconids may have become the original Celestica people who entered Old Hisui, and actually around the time they would have been settling in Hisui, the original Celestica people, is when the Paldean Empire fell. But from 2,000 to 1,200 years ago, the Paldean Empire was reigning strong.
Then, around 1,500 years ago, or during the Paldean Empire, somewhere during the reigns of the rulers, kings, queens, and emperors, the Pokemon Gimmighoul was said to be born in a chest. Though there is already a theory on this channel exploring how this may tie into the Quartet of Ruin and their appearance in the region, so we won't say too much about them here. Other than that, though, we know little about the events that happened during the Paldean Empire. Of course, the closer we get to modern day, the more records are being kept, and that makes sense. All over Paldea are ruined castles and watchtowers where Gimmighoul live, suggesting a region at war, which we've previously mentioned is the case. And during times of war, it's typical for bits of history to be lost, especially if all that knowledge is being kept in the buildings that are being destroyed. In other regions, wars had seemed to have largely stopped. And 1500 years ago, the universal language of the unknown was being put into place with the creation of the Tamboy ruins in the Sevi Islands. So while other nations were collaborating and expanding into language, communication, and other technologies, Paldean Empire was constantly in a state of division and war over whatever treasure lay in the Great Crater.
805 years ago, we get this event referred to in the history classes as Unification, the formation of Paldea, and this is when the school was built. The school is the oldest standing building in the region, and as a result, Mesagoza City is also likely the oldest standing city in the entire region. As we've mentioned, the watchtowers and the forts, it seems like those may have predated the school, but the school is the first time where people started to come together and collaborate, sharing knowledge. The school acts as a sort of giant library, but also exchange of knowledge for all the people within. This school isn't like any old Pokemon school. This building instead represents a point when the region stopped being at war with itself and started working together. The only thing to note that's happening around this time is to the north in the Kalos region, Yveltal or Xerneas are falling asleep or waking up depending on the version. This would represent a giant shift in the infinity energy in the world, so perhaps that is somehow responsible for the end of the wars of Paldea and the unification happening. And while at first it's not even clear that these games are happening alongside the Kalos games in some kind of mega evolution focused timeline, notes that we can find teach us that Roaring Moon looks like a phenomenon happening in another region, i.e. mega evolution, so clearly it does have a lot of Kalos connection.
200 years ago, an expedition team led by a man called Heath finally reached the depths of the crater. There, they discovered Paradox Pokemon, already thriving, as one even attacked them. So how long have they been there for? Since the crater was made? Since 1,000,000 years ago? Or was Heath's appearance in the depths of the crater somehow responsible for these Pokemon's presence? He did, after all, descend with Cyclizar, and when he returned, he wrote the Scarlet and Violet book depicting Miraidon and Koraidon on the cover. So, is it possible his Cyclizar transformed into one of those Pokemon? Or maybe the presence of his Pokemon somehow brought about Paradox forms? Yeah, we simply don't know. What we do know is what Heath found at the heart of the crater. A giant crystal treasure, seemingly the source of terrestrial energy, though at the time no Terra Pokemon had been discovered. There's also a paragraph that mentions how Heath blacked out and had a conversation with someone, or something. He awakes with scribbled down notes for what we now know to be the time machine. It's in his handwriting, and he recognizes it, though he has no memory of writing it at all. These notes would later be used by Sada and Turo to help construct said time machine. Whilst Heath's team are in the crater, they also dig up some metal slab with what looks like a sextant on it. A sextant is a tool, one used for traversal, so possibly more time machine instructions, perhaps left there by the Paldean Empire, or someone from the future sent back in time. When Heath returned to the surface, he also brought with him the Herba Mystica. However, before they had a chance to farm the ones that they planted on the surface, Pokemon had already been drawn to them and eaten them, becoming the first Titan Pokemon. Around this point in time, across the rest of the Pokemon world, the main thing of note is that humans were finally settling in Hisui. You've probably even played this part of history yourself, involving a time traveler, or two. With all this mention of time travel, it makes you wonder, perhaps there is something going on in the Pokemon world making 200 years ago a place that attracts time travelers. It's worth noting as well that the Pokemon of Hisui were said to be more savage than those of other regions, and that's verified here, as not only did Heath travel with a partner Cyclizar, something that would be unusual in Hisui, but when a member of his team is attacked by the Great Tusk or Iron Tread's Pokemon, this is seen to be an unusual occurrence. Pokemon don't usually attack people.
We don't currently know what happened to Heath, but the last page in the Scarlet of a Violet book mentions a third legendary Pokemon with a giant shell filled with hexagons. We may see similar patterns on the floor or on the ceilings of the Time Machine room, and while we know this Pokemon is responsible for terrestrial energy, it seems likely that this Pokemon is also responsible for the creation of time travel somehow. It is also mentioned as being seen by Churro and Sada, so maybe Heath was zapped back in time or into the future by this Pokemon, we just don't know. It's unknown if Heath was alive 140 years ago when the first terrestrial Pokemon emerged from the crater, but given he was already middle-aged / an older man at that time, it seems unlikely. So after he died, and by the time these terrestrial Pokemon were being discovered for the first time, he was being discredited and ridiculed for his wild assertions. 140 years ago, though, does point to something a little bit odd, because the only other thing happening in the Pokemon world at this time was the burning down of the 2 towers of the Johto regions around 150 years ago. And at first, this seems completely unrelated to the Paldea region. It would seem to have no connection to the Scarlet or Violet book. But interestingly enough, inside the Scarlet book, which was written 200 years ago, there's an image of a creature that seems to be a combination of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. Pokemon that 200 years ago shouldn't have existed, because their origins lie in those towers being burnt down 150 years ago. So what's happening here? Is the Pokemon in the book real? Did Raikou, Entei, and Suicune look like this before the tower was burnt? Or is the person drawing this having some kind of premonition of the future as a result of the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey powers of the creature that lives within the crater? Hopefully a future DLC can shed some light on this.
Explorers kept researching at Area Zero, and 87 years ago, research stations were built into the various layers. Understanding Area Zero itself has required generations of work. Of course, none of the characters we interact with in Scarlet and Violet ever actually worked in these stations when they were first built, and we don't really know anything about who would have operated them. I will say as well, this is kind of an odd date, and a weird one that's specifically pointed out. It's a bit of a dead spot in the Pokemon timeline, as nothing else really happens across the rest of the world. Not that we know of anyway. That is, until you realize that 87 years ago for Scarlet and Violet are not 87 years ago for, say, Red and Blue. Generally speaking, the games have fallen along the same timeline as their release, with Scarlet and Violet being set around the Pokemon world's equivalent of 2022. This means 87 years ago for Scarlet and Violet is actually around 65 years for Red and Blue. This, of course, would change the previous dates we've discussed, but when you go over 100 years, people start to generalize. People will say this thing happened 500 years ago, even when they could actually mean 520. It's all a bit vague. So if we take that to be the case, what happened 65 to 87 years ago in the Pokemon world? It's still not a whole lot, actually. Some of Pokemon's oldest characters, like Oak, Drayden, Drake, Agatha, and Kurt, were all being born around that time. So I guess that's something.
And now we enter the true recent history. We know that Arven was born around 16 years ago, and if you place that alongside my timeline from the My Complete Timeline video, that would be just about sometime before Generation 5 is happening. At this point, Sada and Churro are working in the research stations together and building the time machine. According to the notes, time travel was created around this point, and the first Paradox Pokemon they successfully brought through was Koraidon and Miraidon. They tried to bring this Pokemon to the surface, but when people saw it attack a wild Pokemon, they returned it to Area Zero. Arven stopped seeing his parents around then, instead going to study at the school. Around 6 years later, or 10 years ago, they would master the creation of the Terra Orb, with Clavel working on this project alongside Sada and Churro. So this is about when Black and White are actually starting. This would have been around when Arven was 5 or 6, and we don't have a specific date, but we do have this photo of Arven and... Sorry, I'm just reading my script here. Obviously, the Pokemon is Mastiff, but I have Master Chief written here. So this is Arven and Master Chief are in this photo, and then he went and gave the Covenant back their bomb. Anyway, he looks to be around 5 or 6 years old in this photo, and one of his parents, Sada or Churro, depending on the version, would leave to spend more time with him, and using modern technologies the professor left behind, Sada or Churro would create an AI companion to help them. Interestingly enough, in Black and White 2, which is about when this would be timed, the Pokemon World Tournament is happening, which features trainers including the mob boss Giovanni from across the Pokemon world, all of them de-aged from where they should be in the timeline. So I wonder if this can now be explained as the existence of more AI, as we know the technology exists around that time.
Sometime around this point, Sada and Churro have raised Arven in the crater, with either Miraidon or Koraidon. So that's how Arven knows the Pokemon. However, depending on the game you play, because of either Sada or Churro's obsession with Paradox Pokemon, the other parent had to take Arven away from it all. As for Clavel, at this time he doesn't seem to be involved anymore, so instead, Sada and Scarlet, and Turo and Violet, and their AI companion continue to pull Paradox Pokemon in from the past or the future. Now, I find it interesting that there had been no mention of Paradox Pokemon for about 200 years at this point. Not since their discovery by Heath's team, but we know that Sada and Turo are sending back a multitude of Master Balls, possibly to scoop up the very Pokemon that Heath's team found, and perhaps that's why they disappeared for so long, only popping up again 10 years ago once they were being re-released into the crater. And let's not forget that singular Great Tusk, or Iron Treads, that did manage to make it to the surface. If you're wondering how Sada and Turo got their hands on so many Master Balls, then you need to understand that typically Master Balls are given to researchers of high standing, and not in plentiful amounts. But in Paldea, this works slightly differently. You can get given Master Balls for entering the Academy's Hall of Fame by showing excellence, which Sada and Turo both did. Around this point in time, they also pull through another Miraidon or Koraidon and release an army of Paradox Pokemon, which then reproduce in the crater. All these past and future Pokemon, though, are not a good recipe, and this is where the incident at Research Station 4 happened. We're told by the AI companion of the professor that the real-life professor had already died in an incident that happened at Research Station 4. If we look at Research Station 4, we can see crystals jutting out of the ground. We're also told that the professor tried to contain the power of a Pokemon. That Pokemon is never revealed to us exactly what it is. Given the crystals we see, though, I believe it's something to do with the third legendary. You may think that's it, that we're up to date, but Scarlet and Violet are about the past and the future, so there's one final chapter to tell. What happens to Sada and Turo at the end of the game?
Well, we know that Sada's AI goes into the past and Turo's AI went into the future. And this is just speculation, this bit, but I believe the opposite character did the same thing depending on the version you're playing. Allow me to explain. In Pokemon Scarlet, we never meet Turo. I suspect, though, that after helping to raise Arven, in Scarlet version, Turo uses the time machine, following either natural curiosity to see the future, or perhaps looking to undo the incident at Research Station 4 to go into the future to see if he could find anything that could help out that he could send back in time later on. Meanwhile, in Violet, I believe that after raising Arven, Sada goes back in time, again out of natural curiosity, or to prevent this disaster in Area Zero from even happening. This is why we don't see Sada and Turo, despite the fact that they're mentioned in Violet or Scarlet, respectively. And this speculation isn't based on nothing. It's all to do with this metal plate that was dug up by Heath's team. They can't date it. They say maybe it dates back to the Paldean Empire, but it's written on a metal that seems to be unknown to science of the time, science of 200 years ago. I believe the metal is from the future, wherever Turo went, but the engraving is written by Sada in the past, and that's where it was buried. This is a piece of communication between the two professors from across time. Again, the image on here is the sextant, which is about traversing, so perhaps this is the instructions for time travel and how to master time travel. This is information that they're sending back and forth to each other in the past, future, and present so that they're able to read it and create the time machine. While at the end of the game, they look to try and shut down the time machine, they also have to create it. For one simple reason, and it's kind of beautiful. It's for Arven. Because as far as we know, Sada and Turo came together because they were working on the time machine. It's possible that if they weren't ever working on the time machine, Arven would never have existed. So while it's important for them to get the time machine shut down, it's also important to them that it must be made in the first place. Because if it wasn't, if they instead decided to send information back in time to stop the time machine from ever existing, Arven may never exist as well, and they can't have that. And so that's what I believe that Turo is doing in the future. There is one more date super close to modern day, which is about a year and a half ago, to do with the Team Stars story, which according to the timeline would be just after Sword and Shield happened and the DLC happened. I don't really have anything here to say though. Team Stars seems infinitely less impressive than the metal plates and notes being sent from the future back in time to guarantee their own creation.
Well, they did make the entire school change their staff. No small feat. And interestingly, Penny was sent home to the Galar region right after Sword and Shield, so it's possible she could be somewhere among the NPCs in the Crown Tundra, or somewhere on the mainland. Let's keep a lookout for that Easter egg. But in terms of the instructions for time travel, that would make the writing a bootstrap paradox. It exists because it was sent from the future to the past, but only goes to the future because it existed in the past, and was read in the present, and was taken to the future. This may also, in fact, be how the creation of Pokeballs work, given we see Master Balls sent through the time machine, and sure enough, Among Us of the ancient past looks like a Pokeball, but for more on that thought, you're gonna have to go over to the video on my channel.
Thank you all for watching, and don't forget to click the link at the top of the description. This is probably my final video for the year, by the way. So I don't know how long I'm going to be taking a break for. I expect to be back towards the end of January. Make sure you look after yourself. Happy holidays, a happy new year, and of course, soar high, Pokemon Masters.
This is Ash Ketchum. You just watched a video by Birdkeeper Toby. That makes you a Pokemon Master.
Thank you so much to those of you supporting me on Patreon, allowing me to put out as many videos as I have lately, including the big patrons of this month, Anthony Lee, El Gator, Charmander Aznable, and Jedruben. Thank you.